In a small town shrouded in perpetual twilight, a heavy silence hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any hint of cheerfulness. Each evening, the sun sank behind jagged trees that clawed at the sky, casting shadowy figures that danced eerily across the ground. This twilight world enveloped a modest little house at the end of a narrow street. It was a house with sloping roofs and creaky floorboards, covered in weathered shingles that had lost their shine, and even the garden, which used to burst with colorful flowers, now lay wilted and overgrown. This was where a girl named Clara lived with her mother. Clara loved the little house despite its sad appearance. Inside, it was filled with memories, a patchwork quilt her mother had sewn, all of their old books stacked in a corner, and a small kitchen table where they shared countless dinners. Each evening, as the sky darkened and stars flickered to life, Clara could hear the quiet hum of the world outside. It was a sound that usually brought her comfort, but as the nights grew longer and stranger, a peculiar phenomenon would unfold that sent a shiver down her spine. At precisely 9 o'clock, like clockwork, there would be a gentle knock at the front door. Just a single, lonely knock that echoed through the quiet home, causing Clara's mother to pause mid-sentence during their evening talks. Sometimes, they would be sharing a laugh over a funny story or planning ideas for their weekend, but the knock would always cut through their moments, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Clara liked to listen for the knock. It felt like a strange game, one that twisted her excitement and fear into a knot. However, despite her curiosity, nothing awaited her on the porch but the chilling embrace of the night. Sometimes, Clara would peer through the iron gates of their fence, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and intrigue. Could it be a friend, perhaps? Or maybe it was their old neighbor who had fallen on hard times. The street remained deserted, save for shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of the porch light, twisting and turning as if they had secrets of their own. "Who do you think it is?" Clara asked one night, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Her question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty and a hint of dread. "I don't know, sweetheart," her mother replied with a nervous chuckle, though her eyes shone with worry. Probably just the wind or something silly like that. Yet, Clara could tell that her mother didn't truly believe that, not deep down. Each passing night, the subtle anxiety grew, weaving through the fabric of their lives like a dark thread pulling tightly at their seams. But as the days turned into weeks, the knocking persisted. It wasn't just any kind of knock, it grew louder and more insistent. With each rap against the door, Clara could almost feel the vibrations in her bones, as though the home itself was trying to understand what was happening. Clara's mother started to avoid dark corners of the house, her footsteps echoing softly like whispers. The light in their bedroom flickered almost nervously, and Clara noticed that her mother slept with the light on, the warm glow a mere barrier against the encroaching darkness. Clara lay in bed many nights, staring up at the ceiling, her imagination spiraling deeper into the unknown. The remnants of dinner lay untouched on the dining room table, growing cold and congealed, much like the energy that filled their home. Clara's mother, once full of warmth and laughter, now looked tired, burdened by the ominous knocking that arrived nightly. The bags under her eyes grew darker, and the warmth in her smile faded, overshadowed by an invisible weight that seemed to loom over their home like a persistent shadow. One stormy night, when the wind howled like a lost soul searching for a way home, the knocking crescendoed to a heart-thudding rhythm that reverberated through Clara's bones. This time, it felt different, more urgent, like a heartbeat echoing alongside their own. It was as if something out there wanted to be let in, something desperate to cross the threshold into their cautious lives. Clara felt a creeping chill slither through her mind, wrapping around her thoughts tightly like a dark vine. A strange notion flickered within her. It felt as though whoever, or whatever, was knocking needed to be known, to come inside where it was safe. "Mom, please, let's just leave the door closed," Clara pleaded, sensing the dread coiling around them. The very air seemed charged with a sinister energy, stinging her skin and causing goosebumps to rise, the hairs on her arms standing on end. "You know I have to check," her mother breathed, her voice trembling as she approached the door. Clara watched her mother's hand hover just inches from the doorknob, a painful moment stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Clara's heart raced, pounding in time with the knocks, synchronized in fear as they hung in the air. Finally, when the door swung open, the porch remained empty and shadows loomed beyond. The darkness swallowed the light like a monstrous creature lurking just beyond their sight. Clara's mother sighed in relief, her shoulders sagging a little as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. But that relief was short-lived. The air shifted again, charged with a presence unseen, as the knocking resumed, more urgent than before. "What is going on?" Clara whispered, glancing nervously outside. A gust of wind moaned softly, and for a fleeting moment, Clara thought she saw a figure flicker at the edge of the shadows. A fleeting glimpse, a tangible terror that made her heart race faster. Each knock rang out like a blood-curdling whisper, echoing through the very foundations of their lives. A chill gripped Clara's heart, and she felt like a marionette tangled in strings of dread, her fears wrapping tighter around her. As twilight deepened to night, Clara held her breath, her young mind reeling with questions. Who was knocking? What did they want? Did they want to come in and ruin the little happiness that they managed to hold on to? That night, sleep eluded Clara as she clutched her blanket tightly, the imagined horrors of what lurked just beyond her door keeping her wide-eyed and trembling beneath her sheets. Shudders ran through her body, but she did not want to call for her mother. She wanted to be brave, even though that bravery felt as fragile as a spider's web, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Time seemed to crawl as the night stretched on, dragging its feet like a sleepy child. Clara peeled back the curtains, straining to see the world beyond her precious bubble of safety. Outside, it was dark and silent, broken only by the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. A sliver of moonlight painted the world in a ghostly white, illuminating the shadows that flickered across her yard. But then, her darkened reflection stared back at her in the glass, a reminder of the growing isolation that gripped her and her mother. The little girl in the reflection looked frightened, her wide eyes sparkling with unshed tears, reflecting back all the fears that had sprung up inside her. Clara took a deep breath, summoning all her courage, even though each breath felt like a tremor of fear. Maybe, she whispered softly to herself, the idea growing stronger, blossoming like a flower through the cracks of her fear. Maybe the next time it knocks, I will be brave enough to open the door. She locked that thought inside her mind, holding it close like a warm memory against the coldness creeping around her heart. With that thought planted in her heart, Clara closed her eyes and tried to drift off into sleep, letting the darkness wrap around her like a comforting blanket, determined to dispel the shadows that haunted her. But even as she fell asleep, the knocking continued, a steady reminder of the mystery that lay just outside her door. And so, the night wore on, filled with a curious mix of fear and hope for what was yet to come. Clara dreamed of knights and castles, glimmering stars, and magical creatures, while the knocking became a distant echo fading into her slumber, whispering secrets of the unknown. As Clara rested, she unconsciously steeled herself for the morning and the next knock that would surely come. Little did she know that the next knock would change everything. Days faded into nights, and the knocking continued to echo in their small home like a stinky smell that would not go away. Clara's mom became quieter and more distant, her spirit weighed down by the fear that clung to them like dust in the air. Friends and family, who once filled their home with warmth and laughter, slowly stopped coming over. They couldn't bear the sadness that loomed like storm clouds over Clara and her mother. The joy that had once colored their life began to fade, leaving Clara feeling more alone than ever before. In the evenings, when the sun slipped away and the world turned dark, Clara would sit alone on the worn carpet in her bedroom, her knees pulled up to her chin. The room felt smaller with each passing day, the shadows creeping closer as memories of laughter turned to silence. She missed the sound of her mother's voice when it was filled with laughter, and she missed her friends. Sometimes, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wishing for big bright stars to twinkle down and fill her heart with hope. One night, as the clock ticked loudly in the corner, the knocking grew louder, each bang hitting like a drum that could not be ignored. It was as if someone was beating on the door with the force of a giant. Clara sat cross-legged in the middle of her room, her fingers knotted together, squeezing tightly as her heart raced like a car speeding down the road. She shut her eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it pushed in from every side. The noise was a frightening reminder that something was waiting just beyond her reach. Then, in the midst of her rising fear, a daring thought sparked to life in her mind like a firework bursting in the night sky. What if I could confront it? She whispered to herself. What if I knew who, or what, was making that horrible noise? Maybe if she found out, all of her fears would vanish like morning fog. She felt a surge of courage rushing through her veins, mixing with her trembling fear. With her heart pounding louder than the knocking, Clara stood up and took a deep breath. She headed towards the door, feeling as if an invisible string was pulling her forward, leading her into the unknown. As her hand reached for the doorknob, her imagination bloomed with pictures of scary monsters, hideous faces, and claws that could snatch her away in an instant. It was terrifying, yet she felt a thrill of bravery bubbling within her. She was determined to face whatever was waiting just outside. "Mom," Clara called, her voice trembling as the banging erupted again, causing the floor to shudder beneath her bare feet. "I'm going to see what it is." Her voice quivered, but Clara was trying to be brave. Her mother rushed into the hallway, her face painted with worry and fear. "Stop, Clara, don't open the door," she cried, her voice shaking like leaves in the wind. "We shouldn't invite whatever that is in." The shadows of their home closed around them, wrapping them in a thick blanket of dread. But Clara felt hope flickering inside her like a candle against the dark. "I need to know," she said, her small voice giving strength to her wild determination. Gathering all her courage, she twisted the doorknob and opened the door. It creaked loudly, echoing in the stillness of the night. She peered into the outside world, and at first, all she saw was darkness, thick and heavy, wrapping around her like a cloak. The air felt cool against her skin, and it was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that could swallow you whole. Just as she thought she might turn back, she heard it again, the knocking. It shifted and turned into a low, rumbling growl that rolled from inside the house, causing her heart to plummet. "Mom!" she shouted, panic rising like a wave inside her chest. But her voice felt small and weak, almost swallowed by the deep growl which rattled the walls around her. Clara stood frozen, fear acting like glue, holding her feet firmly in place. Her mother dashed past her, and Clara could see panic painted across her face. "Stay here," she yelled, her voice sharp and urgent. Clara watched as her mother hurried to the living room, where shadows danced and twisted, deepening with fear. Clara darted back inside, her mind racing with the fear of what might be hiding in the corners, just waiting to pounce. What if the fairy tale creatures she had heard about were real? What if some ancient monster had made its home behind the walls of their house, luring them into its dark clutches? She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart as questions raced through her mind. Was there truly something lurking in the dark? Clara squeezed her eyes shut tight, wishing she could wake up from this terrible nightmare, but when she opened them again, nothing had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker, filled with unspeakable dread. Then, a sudden gasp escaped her mother's lips, and Clara whipped around to see her mother standing by the wall, her face pale and wide-eyed. "No, stay away from there," her mother's voice rang out, but Clara could feel the cold fingers of fear creeping around her heart. She turned back toward the dark hallway, where echoes of menacing growls mingled with her mother's fighting spirit. A new pounding filled the air, like thunder rolling through their home. But this knocking felt different. It had an eerie determination, almost like it was promising something terrible. Clara shivered as the noise morphed, shifting until it shaped itself into cruel laughter that echoed from deep within the walls. The walls had feelings, had thoughts. Clara could almost believe they were watching, waiting for their moment. Clara felt her legs tremble beneath her, but deep down, some wild part of her spirit sparked again. "I can't give in to this fear," she thought fiercely. Not now, because what if she was brave enough to uncover the truth? What if there was a reason for the knocking? And so, with a heart caught in the cyclone of fear and bravery, Clara made a decision. She was going to discover the source of the knocking, no matter how scared she felt. A strange blend of courage twisted with terror surged through her body, and she took a tentative step back towards the door. The air felt charged, alive with possibilities of what might happen next. She could hear her mother's voice in the background, a worried whisper barely cutting through the chaos that surrounded them. "Clara, please, we don't know what it is. We should stay away." But her mother's words sounded distant, like echoes lost in the wind. Clara placed her hand back on the doorknob, steadying her trembling fingers. This time, she took a deep breath and opened the door wider. Something about the darkness outside felt both welcoming and terrifying. With every step she took into the unknown, she felt alive. The dark air wrapped around her like a cloak of mystery and adventure. The knocking became a rhythm, a heartbeat, encouraging her to move closer. "I have to know," she murmured, her voice gaining strength. "I have to see." As she stepped outside, a chill ran down her spine, but Clara pressed on, feeling the weight of the unknown slip away little by little. The world around her felt strangely quiet and strangely alive, bursting with whispers that danced on the edge of her hearing. It was as if she had entered a secret world, both thrilling and frightening. In that moment, she realized that no matter what loomed in the shadows, Clara had stepped into a story of her own making. This time, she wasn't going to run away from fear, but rather step boldly into it. No longer would she let the shadows swallow her whole. She was ready to find out what was lurking in the dark, whatever it might be. Days passed in a blur of unearthly dread, and each night dragged Clara and her mother deeper into a blackened abyss of horror that felt like an unending nightmare. Their once bright home, filled with laughter and joy, now lay steeped in shadows that thickened like a heavy fog. The walls, once a soft and inviting white, seemed to writhe with malicious anticipation as if they were alive. Clara often caught herself staring at the dark corners of their home, feeling as if eyes were watching her from the shadows. The air grew thick and putrid, heavy with despair that settled like a blanket over them. Silence used to be comforting, but now it felt more like a silent scream, echoing through the empty rooms. Clara noticed strange things in her mother's demeanor. Her once bright and cheerful face had taken on a pallid hue, and her eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now clouded with fear. Each night, Clara could see life draining from her mother's features as if the shadows were leeching her spirit away. Night after night, they lived in a stifling atmosphere thick with unnameable terror that refused to lift. It was a heaviness that pressed down on Clara's chest, making it hard to breathe as though the very walls were trying to crush her. Sleep became a phantom, slipping away like mist through her fingers as she lay in bed, wide-eyed and haunted. The nights stretched on endlessly, filled with darkness that swallowed everything. Clara would close her eyes tightly, willing sleep to take her, but it never did. Instead, she would stare into the oppressive blackness, feeling the heavy gaze of the lurking presence. It seemed to crawl closer every night, like a wild animal stalking its prey, its breath hot and menacing against her skin. The knocking had morphed into a visceral entity, a sinister heartbeat echoing through the halls, pummeling Clara's senses until they felt raw. Each knock seemed to crawl beneath her skin, resonating deeply within her bones. When the clock struck 9, dread flooded their little world anew. Each evening had been a new chapter in their nightly horror story, the crescendo of the knocking increasing like terrifying drumbeats, a call to something dormant within Clara, something dark and twisted that urged her to welcome the terror. One grim night, managed by an almost electric nervous energy that pulsed in the air, Clara stood frozen in front of the door. It had become a battleground between her wavering bravery and the tenacious grip of fear that coiled around her like a snake. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the knocking grew louder, shaking the very foundations of their once safe haven. Each knock echoed deeply, pushing against the door like a beast trying to force its way inside, demanding entry into their fragile sanctuary. "Clara, don't," her mother pleaded from the shadows of their dimly lit living room. The fear in her mother's voice was tangible, trembling like a fragile leaf caught in a storm. The knocking thudded louder, resonating through the air like foreboding thunder as it shook the walls. Clara could see her mother's hands gripping the edge of the sofa, her knuckles white with tension. Ignoring her mother's warning, Clara flung the door open wide, bracing herself for whatever horror awaited her. A crucible of terror unfurled before her, but this time, she didn't see the emptiness that had greeted her earlier. Instead, shadowy figures flickered at the edge of her vision, eerie and many, cloaked in dark shrouds that seemed to soak up light rather than reflect it. Their ragged edges blurred their figures, and for a moment, Clara hesitated, trapped between the worlds of reality and the nightmarish vision before her. The very air hummed and buzzed with energies she could not comprehend, a mix of static that made her hair stand on end. Panic tightened its grip around her heart, squeezing until it felt like she couldn't breathe. She could feel the grip of fear digging into her, but somehow, she also felt an irresistible pull. Something deep within her was urging her to step outside and face the darkness. Unbidden, she found herself whispering words she barely understood. "What do you want? Why are you here?" Her voice wavered but rose above the cacophony of knocking, desperate for answers she feared she wouldn't want to know. With her heart pounding against her chest like a trapped bird, she peered into the rising night, her pulse racing with uncertainty. "Show yourself," she cried, her voice cracking with a blend of terror and defiance. What had she conjured, standing on the precipice of the unfathomable dark? At that very moment, a guttural voice slithered back like a cold mist, worming into her ears like malevolent poison. A vibration rippled through the air as hazy shadows gathered, forming shapes beneath the inky darkness that fell upon them. Clara stumbled backward, feeling a visceral jolt coursing through her as she caught sight of something grotesque. An elongated figure with hollow eyes that glistened like black pits, reflecting an insatiable hunger. "Let us in," the figure rasped, its voice oozing with a dreadful desire that curled around her spine like a serpent. The laughter of many swirled through the night, blending with the voice in a haunting chorus that invaded her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like chains. "Please, no," Clara shouted, summoning every ounce of courage she could muster. Her voice rang out, fighting back against the lure of whatever this horror had become, but doubt clawed at her, a nagging whisper in the back of her mind that maybe she could appease whatever nightmare this was. But just as it seemed to engulf her, the figure slipped away into the shadows, vanishing back into the depths of darkness from whence it came. The knocking subsided, returning to an eerie silence but leaving behind a stark aftertaste of dread, filling every crevice of Clara's mind with lingering fear. It was as if an unseen horror had pressed itself against her very soul, branding her with its grotesque presence. Heart racing, Clara rushed to find her mother, their eyes locking in a knowing terror that echoed through their shared breaths. Even without words, they understood the weight of what had just happened. "Mom, it spoke to me," Clara exclaimed, her voice trembling as a wild mixture of fear and awe coated her words like a thick fog. Her mother paled, her features frozen in choking anguish. "What did it say? Did it ask you to let it in?" she gasped, desperation lacing her tone. "Yes," Clara gasped, her heart pounding like a wild drum. It was horrible. It looked at me with hollow eyes." Tears streamed down her mother's face, glistening like falling raindrops, reflecting an understanding that had morphed into sheer panic. "We must leave. We cannot stay here. It's feeding off our fear." Her mother's voice trembled as she took Clara's hands, squeezing them tightly, as if to anchor herself to reality. But here Clara stood, caught in a storm of confusion. Fear had become a familiar companion, intertwined with her very being, becoming a part of her growing identity. It felt oddly comforting, like an old blanket that wrapped around her tightly. As darkness enveloped them both, Clara found a perverse comfort in the haunting figures that began to feel ever more tangible in her world. She could still feel their presence lingering, like a cruel memory refusing to be forgotten, a promise of darkness coiling around her, their thoughts entwining with hers, merging into something unexplainable. A gnawing thought tugged at the edges of Clara's mind. What if these shadows were not here to harm her? What if they were lost or misunderstood, searching for something they had lost? She didn't dare speak these thoughts aloud, keeping them locked inside her. She sensed that sharing her beliefs might deepen the chasm of fear that already lay between her and her mother. The air felt electric, pulsating with unseen energies that were both terrifying and captivating. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, yet her gaze remained fixed on the door, half hopeful, half afraid. What would happen if the knocking returned? What would she see? It felt almost like a dare, a challenge thrown down that beckoned her to step through the doorway into the unknown, to embrace the dark. "Clara," her mom's shaky voice broke into her racing thoughts. "We need to be together. We need a plan." Clara could see the determination flickering in her mother's eyes, but it was overshadowed by the cloud of despair that had settled in the corners. They huddled on the worn couch, wrapping themselves in a quilt that had faded over time but still held warmth. The room was still thick with tension. As if acknowledging the need for unity, they squeezed each other's hands tightly, forming a bond that felt unbreakable against the gathering shadows. "Maybe I can try to talk to them again," Clara suggested hesitantly, her voice a whisper in the heavy air. "Maybe they don't want to hurt us." Her heart raced at the thought, and she saw the mix of fear and confusion on her mother's face. "Clara, they are not like you and me. You must remember that," her mother replied softly, fear lacing her tone. "They dwell in darkness, and darkness is treacherous." But Clara felt a flicker of understanding within, a spark that told her something different. Perhaps these shadows were more akin to lost souls than monsters. It was a thought that both frightened and intrigued her. What if I can help them? She whispered, half to herself, half to her mother. We will figure this out together, her mother said, optimism wavering in her voice like a candle flickering in the winds of a storm. But, first, we must stay safe and strong. Promise me you'll be careful. Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I promise, Mom. As they sat together, surrounded by the heavy silence that engulfed their home, Clara knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, they were in this together. They had to face the darkness side by side. Little did they know that the knocking would return soon, and with it, the shadows that dwelled in the depths of the dark were growing restless, waiting for their moment to reveal themselves once again. The night stretched ahead like an abyss, each tick of the clock drawing them further into the unknown. Each moment felt fragile, but Clara was determined to unravel the mystery that had ensnared them and discover what truly lay beyond the door. With every passing night, the knocking embraced the silence in a sinister grip, filling Clara's home with an unsettling rhythm. It grew louder and more demanding, insistent, until Clara felt it echoing within the recesses of her mind. The sound was like a heartbeat, drumming away at her fears and drawing her closer to the unknown. But amid it all, the terrifying pull of that otherworldly voice throbbed in her veins. Clara had tasted a new kind of fear, one that was both thrilling and frightening. She had brushed against shadows that lingered just out of reach, and now she found herself yearning to understand what lay hidden in the darkness. Despite the crumbling state of her world, where the walls seemed to sag and the floors creaked under the weight of despair, a fractured sense of calm settled inside her. It was as if she stood at the edge of a great mystery, waiting for the right moment to plunge into the abyss. Something deep within her whispered that this might be her path to understanding, a strange connection between light and dark that beckoned her closer with an alluring gentleness. Her mother's terror felt distant now, like a faint echo against the wicked pulse she felt beneath her skin. The nights wore on, one after the other, and with each twilight came another knock. Each knock was like a whisper, punctuated by guttural echoes that sent Clara spiraling deeper into her confusion. Her mother's frantic cries faded into the background, mere noise dissolving into shadows that stretched around them like dark ripples in a haunting lake. Clara could sense the darkness building, and it was drawing her in, promising something beyond the ordinary. Clara waited breathlessly for the inevitable, the precise moment when the last knock would surge forth, demanding entry into their forsaken home. As twilight descended on the horizon one final time, the clock ticked closer to 9, and the world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for that dreadful moment to crescendo into something wickedly transforming. Clara, please, we must go. Her mother's voice cut through the haze, urgent and desperate like a strangled sob. Clara turned to see her mother, cloaked in shadows, fighting against the overwhelming darkness that seeped into every corner of their home. The look on her mother's face was one of pure terror, eyes wide with fear and pleading for her daughter to remember the love they shared. But Clara shook her head, clenching her fists tightly. She could feel the last knock approaching, building into a rhythm that felt like a savage heartbeat. The pounding thuds resonated in her mind, each one inviting her to embrace this darkness, to give in to the alluring pull that whispered sweetly in her ear. Then, the door erupted open with a force that nearly sent Clara sprawling to the floor. It was as if the air itself had burst from the seams. Figures materialized, stepping through the doorway, their shadows casting long and twisted shapes on the walls. A cacophony of nightmarish laughter filled her ears, twisting her insides with dread. Each figure morphed into something even more wretched, a grotesque mockery of humanity twisted beyond recognition. They were creatures from nightmares, with hollow eyes and elongated limbs that stretched impossibly as if they were made of shadows and whispers. In that moment, Clara felt an inextricable pull within herself. It was as if the darkness recognized her and called to her, drawing her closer with its sinister allure. One of the entities surged forward, closing the distance between them. It brushed its slimy touch against her freckled skin, and a chill shot through her like ice water. "Come closer," it seemed to whisper, the words slithering into her mind like smoke. "So much knowledge awaits you. Embrace us." Clara could hear her mother screaming, her cries piercing through the horrors that swirled around them. "Clara, no, don't do it," came the frantic shout, a desperate echo from the woman who had raised her with love and warmth. But Clara turned, facing the woman who had once been her lifeline, and yet something inside her shifted. Her mother felt like a boat slowly sinking in a rising tide of darkness. Clara's heart shattered against the forceful grasp of insatiable hunger that pulsed within her, promising to consume her whole, to swallow her into an existence that thrummed with power. "Clara, don't, you can't." Her mother's pleas felt far away, distant beyond comprehension, swallowed whole by the sinister chorus surrounding them. The laughter grew louder, drowning out the sounds of the world as Clara looked into her mother's eyes, searching for the bond that had always held them together. But in that moment, the connection felt fragile, strained, as though it might snap under the weight of what was about to happen. The final echoing knock reverberated through the air, a symphony of chaos and promise. With one last instinctual act, Clara stepped forward, arms wide open, inviting the darkness to envelop her, to consume the fragile remnants of her soul. She longed to understand, to be part of something greater, even if it meant crossing into a world filled with shadows. In that instant, an inky abyss poured into her being, and she felt it merge with her, swallowing her whole. The darkness whispered secrets wrapped in promises, and she surrendered to it fully. A slithering embrace wrapped around her, and she succumbed to the laughter that filled the air, the sound echoing like distant thunder, and the world around her began to collapse into an unforgiving oblivion. The last thing she felt was the pull of the shadows as they wrapped around her, enveloping her in their cool, consuming depths. The laughter crescendoed, swirling like a whirlwind of chaos, each note a mockery of joy, until it all crashed down. With that, the colors of her home faded, the warmth of light extinguished, and silence fell like a heavy shroud. In this silence that followed, everything felt different, unnaturally still, echoing the absence of hope. All that once held meaning now lay buried beneath the ground they stood on, long forgotten. Clara looked around, expecting to see the familiar shapes of her world, but there was nothing left to mark the vibrant lives that had lingered in the realm of light. Gone were the sunlit afternoons spent baking cookies with her mother, the laughter that had danced through the air during family dinners, and the sweet melodies sung to her from bedtime stories. Instead, a heavy void replaced those memories, a weight that sat in her chest like a stone. She was adrift in a sea of darkness where fear and folly intertwined, leaving her to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. And yet, within that emptiness, a flicker of something ignited. Deep inside, among the shadows that now held her prisoner, a spark of curiosity bubbled up. Perhaps the darkness did not mean merely to imprison her but could also offer answers she had never dared to seek. Would it reveal to her the secrets of the universe, the truths that eluded her grasp in the light? The questions churned within her, pushing her instinct to flee into a forgotten corner of her mind. Instead, she let herself explore, her senses heightened as the whispers of the darkness wrapped around her like a cloak. What awaited her in this strange, new existence? Would there be power? Would there be understanding? Would she finally become the master of her own fate? But amid her blossoming curiosity, Clara sensed the haunting remnants of her mother's love lingering like a ghost, softly urging her to remember that beneath the curiosity lay the warmth of compassion, the bonds of family that had once brought her joy. Yet that thread felt thin, fraying at the edges as she stood poised on a precipice of darkness that promised to fulfill her deepest desires. The shadows pulsed, beckoning her forward. Clara felt a deep longing, a yearning to know what lay beyond the vast unknown that surrounded her. Could she still find a path of light, even in a world that seemed to thrive on darkness? The knocking, with its menacing rhythm, faded into a memory, leaving only the thrill of possibility in its wake. In the distance, echoes of laughter transformed into something different, a call that was both strange and familiar. Clara took a breath, allowing her heart to bounce back, its rhythm beating to the call of her destiny. She stepped further into the shadows, ready to embrace the newness that awaited, drawing courage from within. Clara would discover the balance between light and dark, forging her own path that would define who she was meant to be. With every step, she could feel the shadows ebb and flow around her, whispering promises of strength and clarity. Clara was ready to face her fears, to delve deep into the heart of darkness, and carve out a new existence in which she was not just a victim but a brave seeker of truth. Whatever the future held, she would face it head-on, embracing the terrifying potential it promised. This was only the beginning, and Clara, with her heart burning bright, was prepared to unlock the secrets of the shadows that sought to envelop her. As she found herself immersed in the darkness, She knew that she was no longer the little girl who had once feared the knock. No, she was something more, a force waiting to be unleashed.